So when I was putting together this presentation, can everybody see it? Can you see it?
Yeah, although it truncated all of a sudden.
Hold on. I moved it to, oh, I paused it. Here we go. I moved it to a different screen, and whenever you do that, it gets confused. There, now
Okay.
you can see it. Yes? Okay. Um, so when I was putting together this presentation, the topic today was designing for care, and I was just really thinking about, what would be the most kind of something interesting that intersects with that, but maybe is a little bit different than anything we're reading about. And actually, one of the things that inspired this, when I put together the questions that are at the top of today's blog post, you might have noticed one of the questions was about how can students care for faculty? And Jesse and I had a little bit of a conversation about that question and the best way to pose that and what that means. And so that just made me kind of start thinking about the whole idea of care, which, in the Q&A today, there was some really great conversation about what that word even means and how that word can be almost weaponized in certain circumstances. Um, but what about when we think about care, not just in terms of care outward towards our students, but care inwards towards ourselves? And so this is a couple of slides to kind of set the stage. Some of you may remember this article. I just pulled this quote because it's such a ridiculous quote. It was in the Chronicle like 6 years ago. And like the poll quote that showed up whenever you shared this article, like on social media, was research shows professors work long hours and spend much of day in meetings. And it really just, to me, that just reads like academic onion. It's like the most obvious thing you can imagine, but it's based on a study that they actually did to prove that professors work long hours and spend much of their days in meetings. And then for some more context, many of us have experienced at kind of the state level or the system level, or just the institutional level, the cuts that have happened, in particular in recent years, to higher education. This has really affected the public system, but I know private schools are not immune. This is one of the most egregious examples. Jesse knows about this one firsthand, having been at the University of Wisconsin when Scott Walker proposed $300 million in cuts. And when asked, well, how are they going to pay for this? He just said, well, professors should just teach one more course a semester. And that'll probably make up the ground, as though that is a solution in any way, and without any acknowledgement for what teaching one more class a semester actually even means. And then I want to acknowledge this as well, which is from this article in the Chronicle that talks about this concept of cultural taxation, which is when the extra work that faculty and staff of color take on, because for lots of different reasons, some of them are kind of systemic administrative reasons where they're called on to be, for example, on committees and search committees because we need representation, but also the way in which they end up becoming symbolic for students of color as a person, a safe place, and a safe person to talk to. And so that adds to their labor, adds to their emotional labor, as well as their, just work labor. And how as a result, they receive a disproportionate number of requests on their time and on their effort. And finally, here in the wake of the virus, as though we're in the wake, in the midst of the virus, this study that came out earlier this year showing that 55% of university faculty have actually considered changing careers or retiring early because of, the toll that this has taken on them. And I think all of us can recognize that this is not a toll that is traced just to, February and March of 2020. This is that was in many ways a straw that broke the camel's back for a lot of faculty after years of increasing workload, budget cuts, fewer opportunities for increases in salary, the increasing adjunctification of the faculty labor pool. That all of these forces, and that's just a few, have really resulted in, for many faculty, kind of an untenable situation for them in their jobs, leading to this sort of result. And then I guess this was the last one leading into what I want to talk about. This was a great one too in the Chronicle, specifically about burnout among professors during the pandemic. And the first sentence of it was this: at first, she thought everything would work out if she just got up earlier. And I think that for me, when I read that, it just jumped out at me, because I think for a lot of faculty, it feels like that's basically all you can do, right? I mean, you are worked to the bone, you're carrying more credit hours than you can manage. Your services is increasing, especially as more full-time faculty disappear and you've got more contingent labor on campus. Students need more. Our students are more vulnerable and more precarious, and so their needs are greater, which leads to a greater demand on our time, and for some of us, an even greater demand than others. And so when faced with those realities and faced with how do I make this job that I got into because I wanted to do work that was so deeply important to me, how do I stay in this job? How do I resolve what feels unresolvable? And sometimes the only thing that seems like you can give is our own personal health. Well, I'll just sleep less, right? I'll skip meals. I'll see less of my family. I'll exercise less. And so I wanted to think about this whole concept of what self-care would look like. And I will preface this by saying self-care is almost a dirty word at this point, because it's been, it's actually, the concept has been around for quite some time. And there's actually some really great kind of literature and research about what self-care is and what it means. But, within the last 4 or 5 years, it's really been sort of taken over in it's become kind of a pop culture phrase. It's an Instagram hashtag that's linked to like women rubbing mango and papaya on their faces. It's not really about what I'm getting at here. And so I want to acknowledge that and ask you to extend a little bit of grace to me for even using this concept of self-care. I hope that the way that I'm using it ends up being meaningful and doesn't feel trite and simplistic. And this definition, I looked around a lot for a definition that would work in this context. A lot of self-care definitions are focused on things like taking care of our physical bodies as a way of taking care of our mental health. And I think that's very important, but it's not necessarily what I'm getting at here. But this definition about self-care really being anything where we're deliberately looking out for our own well-being, giving ourselves grace, compassion, and care, the same grace, compassion, and care that we give to others. And I really liked this definition in the context of what we're doing this week, because we are spending so much time, so much important time talking about grace, compassion, and care for students, and understanding what that mirror looks like when we hold it up to ourselves, right? Not just because it's important to do in the sense of like, make sure you put your oxygen mask on first, but also in the sense of modeling, right? So much of what our students learn, so much of learning happens through modeling. And so how is modeling self-care also a way in which we take care of our students? So this is the question: how do we center care, not just for our students, but for ourselves in the design of our courses and our curriculum? And I will say that some of this comes out of, for further context, work that I've been doing in the last 6 months or so around this concept of critical instructional design, which is basically what Jesse and I were talking about in the article Counter Friction Against the Machine. And in working with faculty at my institution this summer to sort of explore critical instructional design, it became really apparent to me that we can't talk about it without talking about work, and talking about how much work is involved in teaching, and basically questions of labor. And so I'm really interested in whether or not we can't approach the design of our teaching in a way that makes the work more human, and not more human just in terms of it being more just and more human-centered, but more human in the sense that we can actually accomplish it without harming ourselves mentally or physically. So this is the first thing I'm going to say, and a lot of us heard this in spring of 2020. So it's not an unfamiliar refrain: do less. What the questions that I would ask us to pose for ourselves as we're thinking about designing curriculum and designing courses are these: what's the real purpose of our course? What are our hopes for our students? And what do we think our students will remember? So I'd like us to keep those kind of front of mind as we talk about this. And then I just want to add this, that doing less isn't always possible. And so this is another piece of this, which is that sometimes it's not so much about doing less as it is about doing more of what we love. So if we do have to do the work, let's do the work that brings us joy. And let's try and let go of the things that we dread, essentially. The first part is this rethinking content. Again, probably really resonates with all of us from last spring when so many people had to make changes midstream. But what is the purpose of coverage? We talk content coverage gets talked a lot when we're thinking about designing courses and curriculum. What is coverage, and what would a class look like with the least amount of content that you can imagine? Just as a thought exercise, if you could cut a class down to the bare bones of content, what would that look like? Like, what would that feel like? And finally, our colleague Dave Cormier has talked about this, teaching in times of kind of information abundance, when students have information and content, so to speak, at their fingertips through the internet and through the web. Are you teaching content that is abundantly available to them in other ways? And if so, does that content need to be covered or centered in the same way that you've always done it before? I also want to talk about this idea of using class time differently. What can we use class time for that's different than what we've done before? This isn't, too radical, but can students work in class? So instead of assigning homework, work for students to do between class, what happens when we turn class time into work time? Even if we all sit together in a room and write together, that's an important kind of community and communion that can happen. What does that look like? And would that alleviate for us some of the burden of labor? Can students, and this is a self-care piece for students and faculty, can we meditate? Can we walk? Can we tell stories in class? How can we make that part of our curriculum? What about ditching policies that create work? Why do we cling to policies that not only we've identified as harming students, but also bury us in administrative tasks? And this is a quote from Dana today on Yellow Dig. I don't know if Dana's with us right now, but she says, one of the reasons I ditched it, I think this was traditional grading, apart from the fact that it was flat out monstrous, was because it was an absentee policy. One of the reasons I ditched it, apart from the fact that it was flat out monstrous, was because it created a monstrous amount of work for me, keeping track of not only how many times a student was absent, but also how many times a student was late and by how much they were late each time, and then figuring out exactly the number of points to take off their grade. And I think about the work involved in that, the harm that this does to students, the exhaustion you must feel, and how little joy that work brings to anybody. Cancel class. This is probably one that some people might feel is controversial, but what about building mental health days right into our schedule? Why not? Why not model that kind of self-care for our students? We all should do more of that in our lives. And if not canceling class, but also telling students, use this time to do something meaningful and restorative, something that you can tell us about when you come back. Maybe it's taking a nap. Maybe it's going for a hike. Maybe it's reading a book. Maybe it's getting together with friends for coffee. But making space for our students and ourselves to restore our energy as part of class. Talking about pedagogy and learning. What if you replace the labor-intensive class prep sessions with talking to your students about your teaching goals? Something that I say again and again, I wish we were more transparent with our students about talking to them about our pedagogy, the choices we make, the things we're asking them to do and why. What if you replace those discussions asking students about their learning experiences? There have been a couple people this week who have reported what it's like when you actually sit down and talk to students about how school has impacted them in the past, and often how they've been harmed by school in the past. That is an incredibly powerful conversation to happen with students. Why not center that as part of a class, right? When we think about going back to that question about what is the purpose of a class, what if the purpose of our classes isn't so much our disciplines and our fields and our content, but it's about our students learning what learning is, right? Learning what education is, understanding who they are as learners so that they can take that out into the quote unquote real world and use that as they go forward. So why not make that our curriculum? Reconsidering the labor of design itself. What if we spent less time designing and more time talking to our students about the design? And what if we invited them into the design process and turned class over to them? Some of us do that in various ways, but I have this idea, I don't know if anybody's ever done this, like what would it be like to teach a class where the last 2 weeks of class, instead of doing a capstone project, the class designed the next class, right? They looked at the syllabus, they looked at the reading list, they looked at the assignments, they gave feedback, and they helped you design what you would teach the following semester or the following spring or fall. Finding places to collaborate. So even if co-teaching isn't possible because nobody wants to pay for 2 people to teach the same class, are there places where classes overlap, where you and a colleague teach something that's related and you can share your labor, where you come in for one class session and they come in for one class session, or you bring your classes together to talk? Is there a way that that can help you make the work manageable? Sitting in the middle of all of this, I think, is rethinking assessment, but I'm not going to get into that because that's on the docket for tomorrow, and Jessie is definitely going to talk about it. But finally, I'm going to leave you with this, which is the biggest one: learning to say no. And this is really a part of self-care, even outside of education. If you went to see a therapist, they would say, this is part of self-care, is learning to say no. And these are the kinds of questions you have to ask yourself. What's the worst thing that could happen if you said no to this thing? And what's the best thing that could happen for you if you did? And this quote from Audre Lorde: caring for myself is not self-indulgence. So many people feel like making these choices is somehow not living up to the expectations that have been set upon us, that it's self-indulgent. It is actually self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and stop recording.